the conversation that we have with a company, if we go in and we say, we're going to put your company and your product aside. Let's talk about the people you're trying to address and really figure out what this market needs that also plays to your strengths as a company, your capabilities as a company. You can match those two things and clearly see what that problem is you're solving, what that category is you're creating. Then all of your strategy can rally around that, right? Your marketing messages rally around that. Your product roadmap can now see where this thing has to go and where it should go as the future evolves.
What if your biggest growth lever isn't your product, but the space it lives in? Today's guest, Kevin Maney, is the co-author of Play Bigger and co-founder of Category Design Advisors, where he helps founders and CEOs design and lead entirely new markets. With decades of reporting on technology and advising leadership teams, Kevin has helped more than 50 companies define and dominate new categories. His upcoming book, The Category Creation Formula, turns those lessons into a repeatable playbook for ambitious teams ready to lead, not follow. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us here on Innovators Inside today.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lane, Ian, for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're looking forward to this.
Absolutely. So there's a bunch of questions that we want to ask you, and I want to know why you're sitting here with us today and your thoughts on a lot of different things. But I've got a couple of questions that I want to pose to the both of you before we get started here today. So I think, Kevin, we'll start with you. What's one innovation that you hope to see become mainstream in your lifetime? And that's hard because I feel like everything already exists. So,
that's a good one. Well, I one of the things that I like to do with my life when I'm not writing books and working with companies is I'm a musician and write songs, record music, play on stage. And look, I'm used to going into a studio with a very complicated Pro Tools dashboard that's takes a wizard to try to figure out. And as I'm seeing what AI is increasingly able to do, I'm looking for the day when there's an AI studio in my pocket, essentially, that I can just say, like, look, I want a drum track that sounds like Don Henley playing for the Eagles and 4/4 time, and piano that sounds like Ben Montench from Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, and just describe what I'm looking for as a backing track and have it happen. So I have a feeling that's actually not too far away. I would love to see that.
As someone that recently downloaded Pro Tools on their computer, I completely agree. I was thinking about that as I was trying to program a click track. And I was like, I hate this so much.
It's like we live in a world that is like completely shifting the paradigm of what it means to take advantage of expertise to do really special things like music, right? Like I'm not a musician, but I all of a sudden find myself on a podcast with two musicians, which is going to be super exciting for me. But I don't know, have either of you played with Suno or the AI creation tools like it? I haven't played with their studio environment, although they're standing it up, but it seems inevitable. It seems inevitable that you will be able to, as an expert in the space, be able to interact and set up these audio environments and backing tracks and whatever in a different way, soon.
Yeah. And, so I just take this one step further. I'm very fascinated, and I'm working actually on another book right now. It has to do with sort of the human machine partnership, right? Mm. And when I think about this, so I work with this wonderful producer named Tony Calabro here in New York, and he plays every instrument I can't play. He's got fantastic taste and style. But when we're in the studio, we're spending at least half the time just messing with the software, right, and tweaking things.
Yep.
And so this is actually what gets to what AI is really going to do for us, because if this were to exist, what I just described, now Tony can totally focus on the musicianship, right? This is what we're going to spend our time on playing the tracks and on um, having judgment about what works and what doesn't, and then all of that meddling around with the software and the tweaking this and tweaking that would just be verbal instructions. Hey, I'd like that to be louder here, and take that part out there, and it just does it, right? So that would just that's what the beauty of AI is going to be all about, is allowing the humans to do it they can do the best, and let the AI get all the other stuff out of the way. And that's what I'm looking forward to.
That's I was going to say that's interesting. And my next question was,
well, actually, even before we get into that, I hate to do this, but I want to dig in because this is so cool. And so friend of the podcast, Vivian Ming, on a previous episode, and also talks a lot about the human and kind of like AI or human technology partnership. And I think it's really interesting because, for all of the concern, the worry, the stuff that's out there about how technology takes work, changes work, devalues humanity. There's all kinds of things that we can be concerned about, but there's a counterforce where it all gives us more ability to be productive in the space that we love. And all I can think of when I hear things like AI assistance for sort of creative endeavors and expert is actually the way that game design happened in Westworld. Like, did you ever see the late season Westworld? I think the very last season. It's no comment on whether or not the show was able to maintain its quality. It wasn't, although I still love it. But they show an environment, Kevin, like you described, where a woman is a game designer basically for a very complex computer game, but the entire interaction modality is a conversation with an AI assistant going back and forth, and they are pairing to generate this, incredible environment and gameplay. And I saw that and I was like, actually, that does feel like a world we could easily end up in.
Yeah, well, we're sorry if we're getting too off track here, but I've been writing about technology for 40 years. I um, have written extensively about the history of technology. I kind of know how things have played out, and the entire history of computing has made us understand the computers, because the computers were too dumb to understand us, right? Mm-hmm. So we had to learn programming languages, and we had to learn how to operate a piece of software, and Pro Tools is a perfect example. We had to learn how to do it because it couldn't. Now that's what's all turning around, right? So the machine can understand us, and instead of having to learn all that stuff, which was not natural, which was not human, right? Now you can sit with the machine and say, like you would to another human being, this is what I want, make it happen. And then get all of that out of the way so we can do our human stuff better. And that's I think what this is all about.
To play devil's advocate, though, there's a lot of creatives, artists, musicians, writers that really give a lot of pushback to that relationship between creativity and AI, or using that to be able to create money. In my opinion, I think that there's an ethical way that you can still create. And I think that this is what we're talking about, is not using it to create something, but using it to kind of free up your time to, if you create the click track, I'll make the music, kind of a thing. What do you say, or what's your advice to creatives that have that pushback to AI? Because I think that to a certain extent, you have to embrace it, or you're going to end up being left behind. But I don't know if that's the same thing as folks who still take cameras or take photos with film versus using a digital camera, right? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'm not Pollyannish in the sense, you probably saw this thing about the clip of Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise fighting on a roof that was created by AI that was so realistic you couldn't tell it wasn't them, and Hollywood freaked out and all that. Look, so that's flat out wrong, right? And there is going to be so many lawsuits that are going to have to settle this issue of who owns what rights and everything else, right? So but as others have pointed out about that particular incident, for instance, is that if the laws are sorted out and manners of licensing are put in place. So for somebody like Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, it could actually be a boom because um, they could essentially be making movies long after they're dead,
Mhm.
right? Their estates could be, and so there's a lot of sides to this coin, and there's a lot of laws to get worked out to make it to protect people from actually, being able to create and then have it not be stolen by AI, which is kind of what's happening now. But I also think that there's an aspect of it that uh, the more things get created by AI, the more that there's going to be an awareness of this is AI stuff and this is human stuff,
Yeah.
and there's going to be an audience that gravitates towards I want authentic human things, just like there's an audience today that might gravitate towards, say, handmade furniture
Mhm.
versus buying something from IKEA, right? There's going to be a lot of interesting things that happen in that space, I think.
Well, okay. So I have a question for both of you as artists. Um, you know, one of the things that if your hoped for, your aspired, innovation comes to pass, right? It will remove some friction out of achieving your creative vision, right? I mean, that much easier to describe the backing track or the tuning that removes friction and it lets you focus. But I actually have this question: as creatives, do you worry about technology removing friction too much? Like if you extend the metaphor to the handmade furniture, right? People value handmade, human made, furniture versus the mass produced stuff uh, for the labor and the difficulty that goes into it as much as the art, I think.
I don't know. Maybe that's true, I guess. But but yeah, no, I don't know. I mean, we're already seeing that it can remove so much friction that it removes the human altogether, right? I mean, that
Mhm.
somebody can that Brad Pitt thing was done
Sure.
with like apparently two sentences of prompts, and the AI just did the rest.
Well, and you don't need a human to make a table either.
Yeah, right. So I mean, I don't know. Look, we'll flip this around one other way and say, yes, I've been writing about technology for almost 4 decades, and there's never been a time throughout my career when I couldn't look at new innovations or things that were happening and understand where they were going and what they were going to mean like 5 or 10 years out.
Ooh.
This is the first time in my entire life when I have to say I don't know.
Yeah.
That I can guess and everybody can guess, but I just don't know.
I think as a creative, for me, it comes down to value, because like you said, like you can buy a table from IKEA for $20 versus I looked at handcrafted tables recently in the area where I live, and they were like $1,000+ right? And they had little
Mhm.
etchings of epoxy and different colors in them, and it was just very, very cool. But like we get paid, on average, my band, anywhere between $500 to $1,000 an hour. And a lot of people are like, that's so much money. And it's like, well, you have to count for the fact that we all practice, right? We jam, we practice in our spare time. Part of that, what you pay a musician that large amount of money to come, is that practice time and the time that it takes to set up and sound check and do all these things, and the gear that you buy to put into it. And so I think that what I would worry about is that if you used AI to free up that creativity time, right? I think there's 2 points I immediately thought of when I heard your question, Ian. And the first one was, I'm still going to be practicing and creating and thinking and writing and all of those things, but the value of what I'm going to be paid to be a musician might go down. And two, a lot of folks complain about overproduction. And
Mm.
that's been a big complaint on TikTok lately, is that people don't like how folks claim to be singing a cappella or claim to be singing live on TikTok, and you can tell that everything has been auto-tuned to the max and
Sure.
then
Yep.
uploaded to
You get a
TikTok.
reversion to a digital mean that is like, yeah.
Right. And so I think that you have to be careful, because what you don't want to lose is authenticity.
Right. And I think,
Yeah.
going back to all these examples, right? People value authenticity. Certain people do, right? Like there's going to be a crowd that wants the cheaper, easier, whatever. But authenticity is probably going to even be more valuable in an age when it's so easy to make inauthentic stuff.
Yeah, I suspect we're going to come back to this actually later in the podcast. There's some interesting stuff related
We have
to
taken a left
category
turn here, haven't we?
definition and expansion. All right, Lane, on to your next question. Let's do this. That only took us 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, actually, my next question was AI, friend or foe, but I think we answered that with the conversation. So then, let's kind of talk about how this relates to what you do, Kevin. Like, what's led you to be here, and the nature of what you do. Tell us about that.
Yep, sure. Well, some of it we've covered a little bit already, because I started out as a journalist from almost day one, writing about the tech industry, going back to the 1980s. I've written for like every major publication, and interviewed and spent time with all the big heroes of the tech industry. So I really had a steeping in all of that. And along the way, wrote a number of books about either big ideas in tech or a biography of Tom Watson, the guy who built IBM, all these things. And eventually ended up writing a book with these other three Silicon Valley guys called Play Bigger, which came out in 2016. And that book changed the course of my work, because it proposed and sort of popularized this concept that we called category design.
Yeah,
which was a kind of a methodology. We kind of reversed engineered, like how did the greats like Steve Jobs or Mark Benioff with Salesforce, or going back to Lee Iacocca with the minivan, studying these products that created entirely new categories, and how did they do that? And how do we reverse engineer that and create a playbook so that other people can have some ideas about how to see and create these new market categories? And also, part of the reason for doing any of that in the first place was this realization that in most product categories, there is one leader who takes away most of the market share, most of the economics, most of the profits, has the pricing power, sets the agenda for the category. And so if you're an ambitious company leader, why wouldn't you want to do everything in your power to be that company? There's no guarantee you'll be that company, but why wouldn't you do everything possible, right, to be that company?
sure.
So Play Bigger kind of laid all this out, caught on, became part of the conversation in the tech ecosystem. Venture capitalists started handing it out to their portfolio founders, and that turned into a consulting business for me. I started a firm called Category Design Advisors with a partner, Mike Danfus. And over the past 10 years, we've worked with, as you pointed out earlier in the opening, 50 plus companies, and talked to hundreds more, and done a lot of more research about how all this works. And we basically put together everything that we've learned, these new ideas, new methodologies, new ways of thinking about things, in this new book called The Category Creation Formula, which is just out. So that's kind of the short version of the whole path to this moment.
Well, and I love the journey, by the way. And, for most of our audience listens on video, listens on audio, doesn't see the video. But those who can see me might see the giant bald spot. And I earned my stripes in the 80s a little bit too. I grew up with the 286s and 386s of the world. And a lot has changed in the world. But what I think is really interesting is, this question of, is there a formula to thinking about the category versus the market or the product or the competitors? And is that novel? So my question for you to start is, is this way of thinking that you wrote about a decade ago, that you continue to teach, and that you continue to iterate and make more, well, for lack of a better term, formulaic, it's from your title. Is this novel, or is this something related to the emergence of technology and new capabilities, or is this just something that's been hiding in plain sight for as long as humans have been around?
Well, I'll take the hiding in plain sight version of this. So, for instance, I tell a story in the book about the Zamboni. Ian, you're in Canada. I'm sure you're very
Yep.
familiar with Zamboni machines. Um, so take us one step back. Let me describe this category. So one of the things we realized over this past 10 years was that we kind of created new tools for helping companies and leaders think through the opportunity to create a new category. And I'm going to come back to the Zamboni story, but let me set it up with the cat. So the book is called The Category Creation Formula because really the most powerful tool that we found that really works was this very simple formula that we could put up on the board and drive a day-long discussion. And so the formula is simply context plus missing plus innovation equals a new category, a new market category. And so if you break those things down and you drive a discussion along those ways, so context is everything that's happening around your target audience.
Yep.
That could be changes in technology, changes in the economy, geopolitical things happen and supply chains get broken and all of these things.
But changes. Everything that you just said implies a changing state of the context.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
And by the way, we're always in a changing state. But yes,
Fair enough.
but it's truly understanding. Here's the people we're addressing. Let's really have a conversation about like what's changing around that and what's going to drive what's driving people crazy. And if you really have this conversation about the changes in context, you can start to have a conversation about what's missing in this new context. Did it create an entirely new problem that never existed before because of all these changes, or does the technology or something that else that's going on create new ways to solve a problem that's been around forever? And if you can see that missing within this changing and new context, it becomes very easy to see, here's the innovation we can create to solve for this missing in this new context. And if you put all those pieces together, you're pretty much guaranteed to have come out with something that that doesn't yet really exist or isn't really perfected, and that the world needs to have. And so if you see those things, that becomes a very powerful way to see these, to see the elements of what goes into a category like that.
Well, and I think it would be useful for the audience to sort of define category here, because I think, often people, I think, would substitute after the equal sign, product or solution to the pain. Like they'll substitute a lot of words that get floated around. But category to me implies something slightly more abstract, maybe up a level of abstraction and a little vaguer. I don't think that's how you define it. So what does category mean?
No, that's a great question, Ian. So first of all, a new category, a new product category, is literally just a space in our brains, right? That's all it is, because we didn't think about it before, and now you've made us think about it. So, like one of the easy examples I use is about electric cars.
Yep.
Because 20 years ago, conversation about buying a car, it's only gas cars, right? There's nothing. There had been some electric cars, but they sucked, and you're not going to, that wasn't really a consideration. So Tesla comes along, and by making really great electric cars, opens a category in our heads that says, oh, an electric car is actually a choice here. It's not a comparison. It's not like it's better or whatever. It's just a different choice when you're buying a car. And that's an important distinction, right? A new category is a new choice. But what's also important is that to have a category really be strong and really exist in our brains usually requires more, like just one company doing it. We're a little suspicious, right? That, okay, if there's only one of those, maybe that's not like so important, or like that's a lot, odd, right? So if a category opens up the idea that, as Tesla brilliantly did, by the way, by giving away patents and all of this, it opened up the door for the Fords and Volkswagens and GMs of the world to say, we're going to make electric cars too, which starts to validate that category and makes it stronger. So now Tesla doesn't have a small piece of a tiny pie that it created, it has a bigger piece of a giant pie. And so this is what we encourage about companies to say, you don't want to just create a product. You want to open up this new space in people's minds and reinforce it. And one of the ways you reinforce it is by defining this in a way that makes other people say, we want to do it too.
Yeah. And that's a really important point.
It is, yeah.
Would you argue then that I think that you alluded to this, but then so the success of Tesla was contingent upon other people wanting to build electric vehicles? Like, it was when that competition stepped in that's when Tesla became successful? Or, for example, like Netflix, I think would have been another company to do this very early on, that their success was actually a lot more contingent upon other streaming services stepping in and joining that category per se.
It is an important validation factor, right?
Okay.
We go into in the book, we go into the work of this economist who died about 20 years ago, named Paul Gorosky, who studied market categories, and he came up with this very elegant chart that shows the pattern that most categories follow over time. And there's sort of two intersecting lines in this chart, and one is the number of companies in a space. And so if you look at the way that goes, is that if a category that is created, if somebody creates an innovation that never existed before, let's say, and that's day one, if others see it and say, okay, that's important, that has to exist in the world, we're going to do that too. We're going to jump in, usually with different kinds of designs, different versions of that thing, but it's like still chasing the same basic idea. So if a category is real, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to see an escalation in the number of companies saying, we're doing this thing too. And that helps validate the category. Now, the interesting part is that, well, that's happening. The other line is the value of the category, which indicates like how many people are buying this thing and what. That's staying relatively flat because generally speaking, the mass market doesn't like experimentation, right? They don't like to see, they may think that category is sort of on track, but if there's like 5 or 6 different companies, all with different designs, we're like, well, how's this really going to work? Is this really, if we're going to buy this, is it going to be, out of business in a year? So the early adopters like test things and stuff, but they kind of just percolate along the bottom. And then there comes this defining moment. And this is really important to the whole category design process, because as Gorosky identified, there's this defining moment when what he called the dominant design gets chosen by the market. Because the market wants one way this thing works, right? We don't want electric cars to work 5 different ways and 5 different ways you plug it in or start it, whatever, because that then if it gets too confusing, whatever. We want one way. So eventually the market decides on that dominant design. And when that happens, the number of competitors usually falls away. They either get absorbed into the dominant design or they just disappear. And the other thing that happens is the market takes off, because now we're comfortable with this thing. Now we believe in it and in what we're going to do. So as that plays out, fewer numbers of companies capture all the value. And the important thing here is if you're a company and you believe creating a market category and you want to drive this thing, what you have to keep your eye on the ball, that your most important thing is winning the dominant design. It's not being first to market. This is why an explanation of why that first mover advantage thing is really kind of bullcrap, because it doesn't necessarily guarantee you're going to win the dominant design. Winning the dominant design is everything.
Well, and it's a really interesting framing. I was going to get to this. I'm glad you mentioned first mover. I mean, when it often surprises people when I say something along the lines of, I actually can't think of very many first movers who ended up as the dominant force in their category. In fact, it's very, very few. And even then, you could almost always argue that they weren't actually the first mover. Right? Yeah. Like you could make an argument actually that Tesla is not the first mover in the electric car category, because they weren't, but they certainly redefined the category maybe in their own vision. And it is really interesting because I think so often we get lost in this question of how do I establish moats around my product, my IP, my business? How do we protect what we have won or what we believe we can win? And Kevin, what I hear you saying, and I'm playing back in my own words, so you can tell me I'm an idiot, but what I hear you saying is you can kind of ignore all that, focus on what is the category that we're trying to define and what does it take to be the best player in that category.
Yes, all of that, but there's one other element that's super important, and that is actually continuing to create the bias in your audience's heads that you are the category leader, that you know how this thing is going to work, that you're setting the rules, and that's a process you have to do constantly throughout the years, so that you are perceived as a leader. I mean, this all goes back to like, look, for decades we've automatically gone to Google and searched because it established that bias in our heads. Even Microsoft comes along and says, well, the search results from Bing are better, and we all don't care because
doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, right?
So
I want to go back in because I don't want to lose this thread of you asked me about, started this out by asking me, is this something that's been in the air forever and we didn't just capture it? And I started to say about the Zamboni machine, right? If you think about the category formula we just talked about, and so there was a guy named Frank Zamboni, and he was in Los Angeles, of all places, right, where the Zamboni machine's born. And you go back to pre-1930s, and the Zamboni family had an ice making company, right? An ice box company, right? They made ice for home ice boxes and for free before electricity, right? That was their business in Los Angeles, and it was that every town had ice companies, right? That made the ice for the ice boxes in people's homes. So then electricity comes along, and people start buying electric refrigerators, and ice is no longer a great business. But the Zamboni family knows how to make ice. And so they're kind of searching around for like, what do we do with our knowledge and capabilities? And figure skating was starting to become more popular, but the Olympic sport, things like that, people were following it. And so they built an ice rink in LA.
Yeah.
So now they have an ice rink, and maintaining the ice rink means having a bunch of guys with mops and brooms and scrapers go out and take like 45 minutes to clean the ice. So amid all of this, Frank Zamboni is thinking about this and thinking, okay, here's this new context of like, electricity. We got an ice rink. We got this problem of, it takes away from our ability to have a good business. And also in his mind, he's thinking, you talk about technology. This was right around as like the beginning of World War II. And there's things like 4-wheel drive Jeeps that are starting to be made. And it's like, so he starts putting all these things together. All this is context, right?
Yeah.
And the missing for him is that there was, it was really hurting business to have to take so much of the day out to clean the ice or have bad ice that people didn't like to skate on. So he has the context, he has the missing, and he says, okay, well, I can create an innovation using these new 4-wheel drive technologies, and build this contraption. In fact, the first Zamboni that he built was literally a Jeep chassis that he put this big wooden box on the top and a conveyor belt and the whole thing.
I need to find a photo of this.
There is a photo of it. You can see, you can find it online. And
that'll be one for the show notes.
He creates this thing, and it works, right? And suddenly, talk about creating a category, right? Ice rinks all around the country and all, in Canada, whatever, start to see this innovation, and they want one too, and then others start to make the same product. So this was again, like, people have been doing this forever, and part of what we did when we did our research was to try to understand what were the mechanisms that went into that, and then you kind of extract from that these ways and playbooks that people can use today.
Yeah. So I love that story, and I think it definitely answers the question, but it exposes for me a question of how much you can sort of predict and model in advance versus how much you discover along the way. And so I want to come back to this question about the level of abstraction you have to operate at with categories, because I think that's actually really fascinating. But in the Zamboni story, they did not set out to create a Zamboni. They did not set out to make it easier and therefore cheaper and much more productive to create new ice rinks all over the place, right? They did not set out there. They followed a process of looking at the context, looking at kind of pain points, and it was an iterative process, it sounds like. So how do you get to a place where you can start to actually say, I understand the category that we are playing in, and what does the process look like to get there?
So I believe that most companies look at things backwards. That they look. I think the industry has been haunted by this phrase "product market fit" for 2 decades.
You're talking to some startup people that are like, yeah, do you have product market fit? So yeah, tell us.
But what product market fit to me says is we've built a product and now we have to figure out a market for it, right? Or figure out where it fits in a market. That's literally what it says, right? If you turn that around and make the phrase market product fit,
yeah,
then it starts to tell you that the first thing you should be looking for is the market that needs something, right?
Yeah.
And let's build a product to serve that particular market. If you do that, then the market you're addressing is just going to suck the product right out of your company. Basically, it's going to create demand. And so most companies, in my experience, when they sit around creating strategy, we've got this product. What's our strategy for beating the competition, for marketing, getting it marketed, finding a place where it's going to resonate, all those things, right? The conversation that we have with a company, if we go in and we say, we're going to put your company and your product aside. Let's talk about the people you're trying to address and really figure out what this market needs that also plays to your strengths as a company, your capabilities as a company.
Yeah.
You can match those two things and clearly see what that problem is you're solving, what that category is you're creating. Then all of your strategy can rally around that, right? Your marketing messages rally around that. Your product roadmap can now see where this thing has to go and where it should go as the future evolves. And it does what if you do it that way, it creates a focus that doesn't usually exist, or often doesn't exist inside of a lot of companies. And I think that's where the advantage comes from by trying to have this mindset.
So there's a classic problem that exists in all of new venture creation, and it exists across kind of market research and discovery writ large, and that is that typically customers are real crap at telling you what their problems are and what they actually need or want, right? Because they don't know. How do you, as a company trying to understand the category you're going to be playing in, how do you get the voice of the market, the voice of the category, without somebody having thought about it before and being able to answer you and be like, oh yes, like of course I want an EV that can do X, Y, and Z?
No, and it's a great question, and there's the apocryphal thing, right, of Henry Ford saying, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. That your customers are really only going to know, for the most part, what exists. They're not going to have the imagination to imagine something that doesn't yet exist. And so this is where an element of creativity has to come into the process, right? So when we go working with a company, for instance, we're going to say, okay, listening to your customers and building what they want is not the answer to creating something new and interesting and innovative, right? What is the answer is truly understanding your customers and understanding that market, that sector, whatever, but also being able to abstract from that this whole idea of like, but what is missing? And what can we create that solves problems that people don't even know they have yet, or that they never thought they could solve?
Yeah.
So we're trying to drive a conversation that goes above and beyond what is just listening to your customers' needs, right? It's about like, how do we take that and use it to then create something that's brand new.
Awesome. And a different way of thinking, I think, for a lot of people. And so it's nice that you're able to identify and pull out patterns. I love equations, by the way. Absolutely love equations. Because they always make things look easier than they are.
Right. Equal energy squared. Yeah, we can build a nuclear reactor.
Exactly.
Actually, speaking of formulas, I know that there is no formula for this, but I was kind of thinking about, your story about the Zambonis, and not all vehicles that drive along the ice are a Zamboni, but we call them all Zambonis.
That's right.
Not every cotton swab is a Q-tip.
That's true.
We call them Q-tips.
Is that true? We're just like everything on an ice is a Zamboni?
Well,
there are other makers of Zamboni.
Oh, it's like the Kleenex. I never even thought about I didn't even know that. That's awesome.
Or like tissue, for example, right? Like it's Kleenex and tissue, Band-Aids, and I can probably go on forever about. So what is your coaching with regard to branding and messaging throughout this, that you ensure that you become the Q-tip of your category? Or is that all just kind of coming down to luck and timing?
But here's an important point that I would say is that the category and brand are two different things.
Okay.
That has to be paramount, right? So, you have, a category is small letters, right? It's smartphone, it's microwave oven, it's cute, it's cotton swab, right? Those are categories. And your brand has to sit within that. I can't say that I have some formula for how do you make your brand be a synonym for the category with almost small letters, right? But many times category creators who become true category leaders, that ends up happening, right? I mean, the Zamboni, Google, you become a verb, right? I'm going to Google this. But I don't think there's a proven path for making that happen.
No, that's fair.
Okay. So this formula stuff is absolutely fascinating because it provides a playbook to an extent, right? And I think that's really important. And it provides a playbook to understand, again, your words, like the category we're operating in. But I am really stuck on how do you know you've nailed the category? So let's take cotton swabs. Like I wouldn't say cotton swab is the category. But is it ear cleaning? Is it cotton things you stick in your ear? Is it, the category of making you feel like you are maintaining hygiene at home, whether or not you are? Like, I feel like you can define these things a million ways. And that actually really matters because people are driven by subconscious, latent and emotional motivations to make decisions that might, be something different than is sort of on the box. So, I'm going all over the board, but I'm going to keep coming back to this question of how do you know you've nailed the definition of the category and you can actually understand, what is driving decision making for your customers?
Yeah, well, on day one you can't know. You're putting something out there.
That's humbling, but important, actually, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, going back to the musician things, right? We can write a song. Is it going to be a hit record? I mean, you and I could think it's the most awesome song in the world, but how that works. I mean, there are a couple of indications. So the first one goes back to the conversation about the Gorosky curve, right? If you introduce this thing into the world, and nobody decides to follow you, you've probably created something that isn't really catching on.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter to people. So one of the first signs is other companies coming into the space and saying, I'm going to do that too. And then you can also tell when it starts to come back to you, your language starts coming back to you. Look, I experienced this myself. We wrote a book, created the category of category design, and put it out there. And then when other people started talking about category design, not even knowing that it came from our book. That's when we knew that we had created an actual category. And there are literally thousands of people now that say that their profession is category designer.
That's awesome, by the way.
It is awesome. It is truly actually awesome. And people write like blog posts and things about category design and have no reference to play. They have no idea where it came from. Like it's just somewhere in the atmosphere. So when those kinds of things start happening, that's certainly a major indication of having achieved that goal.
What about Netflix though? Because I would argue that Netflix blew up way before the validation of other streaming services coming into play. Or were they in a different category? They were they were in the category of, say, video delivery or video services, and that's why they blew out Blockbuster, and then somehow a new category formed out of that. Like I'm arguing the point a little bit that I think every once in a while, like, something blows up before that validation, or is that just kind of the exception to the rule?
Your question leads me to be able to explain a little bit about another concept in the book that Reed Hastings played beautifully. So there's another piece of conversation that we often have is something that we call the adjacent possible. And so we actually borrowed this from a book by Stephen Johnson called Where Good Ideas Come From, and modified it slightly for our purposes. But if you can imagine an XY axis, right? And the vertical axis is technology's capabilities. And the horizontal axis is all of us, our ability to adopt and absorb new technologies. Those things play off of each other. And so if you imagine that in, kind of a line that goes from, across ways, and there's an area to the bottom left, which is everything that is possible and exists and we use every day, right? So and all those things are technologies that work and that we use in our daily lives.
Yeah,
those are categories that exist, and we understand them and they work. And then if there's a barrier between those things, then the outside of that is stuff that doesn't yet exist and that we don't quite know how to use in our lives. So quantum computing might sit out there somewhere, right? It's still a lab experiment. We think it's going to happen someday, but you and I aren't thinking about what are we going to do when we have a quantum computer in our living room. And as Johnson discovered when he did his research about why certain concepts take off when they do, that there's this band between those two spaces that he calls the adjacent possible, which is when the technology is just pushed a little farther than it has been before, so it seems new and cool, and we're able to absorb what that's going to be, but it's new, right? It's new and exciting. So it pushes both a little bit, and so if you introduce a product that's out there in the not yet possible, people aren't going to get it. It's not going to quite going to work. If you start a company and you stick with that vision that's going to take 10 years to get there, you're going to run out of money and time before you actually have a profitable company.
Absolutely.
If you start a product or launch a product that's in that already possible, you're probably launching into something category that already exists. It's going to be a commodity. It's not going to be that interesting. So you want to land on this adjacent possible. Now, how do I go into all this about Reed Hastings? So I've interviewed him going way back, and I understood like this question and what he was doing. He called it Netflix from the beginning because he knew eventually you were going to be able to offer movies over the internet.
Yeah.
But when he started Netflix, that wasn't truly possible yet, right? We still had dial-up modems and crappy connections, and the licensing stuff just didn't work or whatever. It was not going to happen.
Yeah.
So he starts the company by we'll mail you these DVDs, because at least we know that there's, going back to the category formula, that you hate having the late fees at the Blockbuster and having to go to the store and the whole thing, right? So he introduces this concept and is continually monitoring as the years go on what's going on with the internet. When is it going to be possible to start offering streaming movies. And then at some point, I can't remember the year it was, we started to make that transition. And what was brilliant about that too was that he took us on a journey. He established a brand that we associated with that journey, and we became comfortable with the idea that Netflix knew where this was all going.
Mm.
And I believe that is one of the reasons that it won customers early, and they stuck with Netflix as that transition happened, because he painted this picture of, not only are we landing in the adjacent possible today, but I understand where this is going, and I'm going to take you there. And that's an important thing that we try to tell companies to do, is when you're dreaming up this new product or service, land it in the adjacent possible today, but have an understanding of where it's going, and make sure your customers know that you're going to take them on that journey.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, this is really interesting. Boy, we need to dig in a second on enterprise-centric innovation, but just on this Netflix question, I'm still struggling with how we're thinking about the category that Netflix knew that they were playing in, right? And I realize, like, so much ink has been spilled, obviously, on the case study on the topic of Netflix, but it strikes me that you can look at this as we are in the category of movie watching or video rentals or TV-based entertainment. You could define it as we are in the category of frictionless access to video entertainment, right? Which differentiates versus kind of the incumbents and guides their strategy toward reducing the friction over time to streaming. You can also say, actually, like, the adjacent possible is the idea that all forms of entertainment everywhere should be able to be delivered to you instantly. And so actually we're competing in a category of attention, or the amount of attention that is allocated to entertainment at any given moment. And it strikes me that each of those could lead a management team and a product team in very different directions. Is there something that we can learn there about not just, the definition of the category, but focus on it over time, so that you don't get distracted by, maybe something that's a couple degrees of adjacency out there, et cetera?
Let me say a couple things about that. So, and again, going back to the idea that we studied people who created categories in the past, none of them ever talked about that way, right? I mean, so we introduced a lexicon that describes something that really brilliant innovators did naturally. And probably never described it that way. So now the reason that it's useful is it just becomes a mechanism for having this conversation about what are we doing, why does the market need us, how can we not only introduce something new but actually bring others along and yet win that dominant design over time. It's a mechanism for having these conversations, but by having these conversations and defining, and so an ultimate product of what we do and what we tell companies to do is to write this, essentially, this Declaration of Independence, this manifesto, this document that puts into words,
what a cool tool,
what the context is, what the problem to be solved is, what the solution to that problem looks like, where it's going, why you're the ones that are going to bring this to the world. Write it down, make it into something your whole leadership team would sign their names to the bottom of, because what it produces is not necessarily always the exact right answer, but it produces alignment around a mission that you're going to pursue, and you can adjust from there if you have to. But at least you have focus and mission and alignment.
You're all marching in the same direction
around an idea that you believe is right. And that in itself can be the most important thing a company has going for it.
So what about timing? Like being too ahead of the curve or too late? Like we talked about Netflix and how he was like, the timing's not right. But what about things that are just a little bit, I feel like we move rapidly with AI, and yet at the same time, you can still be too ahead of the curve. How do you know when it's the right time to launch
Well, again,
something?
some of it is, we're relying on the instincts of the people that we're talking to. So we'll put this adjacent possible thing up on there and have a discussion around it. Where are you, this thing that you're describing that you're going to build? Where would you put it on that chart?
Yeah.
And if you would put it somewhere that says like, look, this isn't really going to work for 3 years. Part of the conversation becomes like, okay, if that's true, how do we like dial that back and offer something now that lands in that adjacent possible space and know that you're going to move towards this thing in 3 years. Or, like the other thing is like, look at that and say, look, you're describing something that 50 other companies are doing. And it's in that, already possible space. And look, I mean, there's thousands of companies that build perfectly good businesses taking 5% market share from somebody else's category. If that's what you want to do, that's great. I mean, that's viable. But if you're one of those ambitious founders or company leaders or department leaders inside a big company, and you want to do something that's above and beyond that, then seeing and creating this new category is a path towards that.
Okay. So you gave me the opening. I got to dive into the hard thing. We are recording this, I think, literally on the eve of the release of the book.
Yes.
And, so the world's going to change tomorrow in ways minor and major. And I'm super excited about that. But every example that we've talked about so far, most of the examples have either been at a small organization or a startup, a new organization or something that was able to pivot and change. Does this concept, does the category creation formula change some of that, just the, immovable forces that make change and innovation so hard in enterprise, right? Does this actually change something for the GMs, the business line managers that are trying to adapt to a context that is changing around them? Or are we all still sort of stuck in the innovator's dilemma? Like, what do you tell people who are worried about the historical success rate or lack thereof of innovation and change inside large companies?
So yeah, I mean, it is a great question. And yes, I mean, many large companies get stuck in the problem of, am I going to create something that cannibalizes something that I already have that's a profit center, and all those problems come to bear. And so a startup has a lot more leeway to just dive into something, right, brand new. But I mean, the history of corporate, America or corporations around the world, I mean, there have been many groundbreaking innovations that have come out of them. One of the ones we write about all the time is to go back to Chrysler in the 1980s and creating the minivan.
Yep.
And here's a company that had been around for God knows how many decades at that point in time and had a whole product line. Now, one of the things that ends up being key to that was that its back was against the wall, right? It was going bankrupt. It needed to do something radical. But if you kind of look at the way they sussed this out, they realized that there was a changing context, baby boomers moving out to the suburbs, having multiple kids, having, soccer practices, baseball practices, and, all this stuff. And that there were frustrations with the kinds of cars you could get. You get a station wagon, and have your kids roll around in the back and fly out if you had an accident.
I miss those days.
I miss those days when there were no seat belts and, or a big old van that drove like a truck, they came up with this concept of a van that would fit in your garage and hold a family of 5 and a dog and drove like a car, so that the moms of the world would feel comfortable in this thing, and they marketed it as a solution to this problem. By the way, they created a category called minivan, but a brand that was separate, Dodge Caravan, Plymouth Voyager. And they did this all inside of but here's also another important point about that, was that category creation, especially inside of a large enterprise, has to be a CEO blessed or driven thing. Lee Iacocca was totally behind this, right? Back in those days, and I don't think these kinds of innovations happen without top level support and maybe putting in place mechanisms so it's able to happen.
Well, this is really, really fascinating, Kevin. I actually really appreciate you coming on Innovators Inside. I think everyone in our audience needs to go out and either read or listen to the category creation formula. I know that I'm excited for it to come out tomorrow. If you had to leave the audience with one important but non-intuitive thought, what would that be? What's the nugget that you want to live like a brainworm, rent-free in their head for the next 6 weeks while they get more and more frustrated thinking about how to solve it, and then they shoot you an email and say, I got it?
I don't know if this is how non-intuitive it is, but I mean, look, the basic message that we have is that if you are you're an ambitious founder, innovator inside a company, entrepreneur, whatever, and you want to change the way we live and work, and do something that's that's memorable and also profitable, a path to doing that is to create these new market categories, these new spaces in our brains that are both something the world needs to have existing and is something that you can do. And if you put all those pieces together, it does make magic. And it's not for everybody, but if it's for you, it's a path to doing that.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Kevin, thank you. You've brought field-tested insights, something that is very practical and insightful to the audience. Really appreciate you coming and joining us today on Innovators Inside. I just want to say congratulations on the impending launch of the book. We're all really excited to get our hands on it. And thanks again. It was an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, both of you.
All right. Thanks, Kevin.